Spirit of God, unbind our minds and hearts. And in the places of our fear and resistance, give us peace and transformation, so that we might hear your liberating word and join in the work that is liberating for all. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So today, we are reading from Matthew's Gospel. I'll say something more about the 4-week sermon series that will become 2 weeks in just a minute. But this is where Jesus has just told the disciples that there is nothing outside that can defile, that is what is in our hearts, and then turns around and calls a woman from another land a dog. There is no easy way to deal with that, so we're just going to head right into it. Chapter 15, beginning at verse 21. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged Jesus, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." Jesus said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "Is it not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs?" She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall on their master's floor." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed immediately. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. That's some tough stuff. There's no way to explain it away, and I am going to talk about it in a few minutes. We have done all sorts of things over the years to celebrate Black history, from the pulpit and in other ways, to talking about the great legacy of many Presbyterians, African American, who have made a huge difference in the life of our church and in our nation. But this year, I decided to go back and take a closer look at one of the final addresses and one of the final topics that Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King lifted up. And in fact, it was at a church gathering. It was the General Synod of the United Church of Christ in 1967. And the address was originally titled, "America's Chief Moral Dilemma." Now, in that address, we now know that he identified 3 great evils afflicting American society. This is 1967. And he said these 3 were racism, poverty, and militarism. Now, this month, what I planned, there's only 3 and there's 4 weeks. There really was a 4th. Because what I believe is that it's not just about looking back, it's about looking forward. What it is that he said all those years ago and recognizing what we have not yet accomplished. One of the things that few church leaders spoke about back then, and even today, is issues of sexuality. And so that is the 4th that we are planning on talking about. Not today. I'm going to focus solely on racism. But we cannot talk about any one of those things without touching other major issues. That's the good news, since we have 2 weeks to cover 4 weeks of material. I jokingly said I hadn't been in the pulpit so long I probably could preach for an hour and a half. And someone said this week, "Yes, but no one will be there when you're done." Here's where I want to start. I think it might be time to talk less about racism. Yes, I really did say that. I think it's time to talk less about racism, not about the realities, but about the word itself. You see, when people hear the word racism, let me rephrase that. When white folks generally hear the word racism, what they think about is the trouble that black and brown people have faced. Boy, isn't that a shame. Or, for a lot of white folks, racism is really just not our problem because it doesn't impact us on a day-to-day basis. And at the end of the day, it really is about thinking, and I'm a nice person, so why are we still talking about this? And then, something changes. But it's not going to change until we deal with what racism really was. One of the deep underlying problems for a lot of white liberal folk, I'll talk about everybody in a minute, but I'm talking about some of my own stuff, is that we believe on some level that racism is going to be overcome by smiling and being nice. Seriously. That maybe with enough education, with enough talk, with enough singing Kumbaya, that racism will somehow go the way of the eastern mountain lion. By the way, it went extinct last week. A lot of white folks say, I don't have bad feelings about non-white people. I even have a black friend. I go to a church with a lot of black folk. I shake their hand during the passing of the peace even. All that stuff will not change the reality of racism. And it is not enough. Being nice will not overcome the mess. And Dr. King was no fool. If you read that address and listen to what he wrote, when he talked about racism as a great social evil, he was not talking about white people's attitudes much. He was talking about the bigger systems. He talked about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Jim Crow laws, segregation enforced through government policy, housing, employment, and school disparity. That was all public policy. None of them were overcome by changing attitudes or a few diversity trainings. Dr. King's own words, quote, "We've never made any gain in civil rights without constant, persistent, legal, and nonviolent pressure. Don't let anybody make you feel that the problem will work itself out." End quote. Nothing will change until we put our hands to the plow and join in the work. Now, I might not want to spend too much time on the nonviolent piece because we fought a civil war that proved otherwise. The bloodiest war in American history. John Brown was probably right on that point. History proved him right, that it was going to take violence and bloodshed. Nothing is changed unless there is a direct campaign of resistance. And here we stand all these years later, and some politician has the audacity to say, well, you know, it was the 1980s when I wore blackface in college, graduate school. Oh, that wasn't me in that Klan outfit. Whatever it was. The fact that all of this has come parading out because our leaders have said it's okay, there's some nice white folk over there on that side of Nazis. And it's come out of the woodwork. And some level, that's helpful, right? It's helpful because at least we know when the folks start putting on the hats who they are now. Many, many years where that went into hiding. Yet here's the thing, and Dr. King understood this, that even with the changes in the law, the actual struggle for general equity was sort of kicked to the curb. And I think, ultimately, this is why I think we need to use the word racism a lot less. If we're really going to make a change, what we need to do is start talking about the system of white supremacy. It holds our country in a deep grip. Our country was founded, we are told, in school many times that our country was founded on high ideals. But we always seem to leave out the part about the country being built by people who had been enslaved. Or the genocide of an entire native population, so much so that the climate changed as we killed them off. There's a whole article on that this past week came out maybe 2 weeks ago. And all the while, and here's the insidious piece of it all the while, these were folks who believed they loved Jesus. That was their theology. Manifest destiny. Believing that Jesus, well, you can look in the documents as we began conquests many, many years ago. The question came up, we see these other people, are they fully human? That was the question the church was asking itself. If they were human, we could own them, and then we'd have to baptize them, and then would that make us brothers and sisters with them? And they spent volumes trying to figure this stuff out. When in reality, what they wanted was cheap labor to build another empire. You can argue with me on that point, but I'm willing to hang in there on that argument. The followers of Jesus created theological systems that questioned the very humanity of other human beings who did not have white skin and could not own property. It is written into our country. It is written into our faith. So we have to do the hard work of figuring out what's worth saving and what needs to go into the ash heap of history. And yet, if we're nice, everything's going to work out. The truth of the matter is, it's in the air we breathe. And because of it, we have to be deliberate in our work to challenge it. It isn't something just out there. And it's particularly important for white folk. I've been struggling with something as I've been working on my doctorate. As this concept that maybe at some point it might not be possible for white folk and non-white folk to be in relationship in a church together in a really authentic way. Yeah. Because that requires us to go deeper, and what I find is a lot of white folk don't have any clue about the realities of the history of race and expect black folk to do the work for them. I know I'm mentally now. But if we live in a land where that exists all the time, if we come in here, we have to recognize that's part of the reality. White folk in particular are taught not to know their history and then believe that they know it. And that all we needed to do was smile and be nice. Extra nice, too, so we can prove that we're really not bad people and that we're not racist like those other folks out there, and the president really isn't like who we are. The president's not the problem, just another symptom. In the time of resurgent blackface and white supremacy being allowed from the halls of power, we can't remain silent, and we have to do some interior work of owning the stuff that we got, that we inherited. I think I've told you before, my father's father was a Klansman. I know about my family's history. I can tell details about it. Now I can talk about, the immigrant side and how hard they had to work. It didn't take but a generation to lose that stuff and just look white like everybody else. Or those federal loans to the returning veterans from World War II, of which my grandparents and my parents were able to build wealth that was not available to African Americans. These are things you already know. I'm just throwing them in for seasoning. And that's why I think on some level, here in the gospel, I know you were wondering when I was going to get to Jesus. So here we are. The reason that Jesus engages with this woman and doesn't engage her has something to teach us as we struggle with it. It's a difficult passage where Jesus calls a woman who is not of Jewish descent a dog. Now, there are commentators for a short period of time where that term dog, they tried to convince us that somehow the Greek meant little puppy. And that was okay, because we like our puppies and our dogs. They're like just one of the family. Interestingly enough, it was in the 1950s and the 1940s where that interpretation came out. I'll let you do the math on that. It was white scholars who came up with that. It's not in the Greek. It was a derogatory term, a slang to call someone less than human. Dogs were specifically hated in the Bible. There's nowhere in the Bible where it's like, Jesus, go, we got our house bed. Yeah. Dogs were not seen as nice at all. Then it's clear that in that moment, that in front of the disciples, Jesus is putting this other group of people down compared to his own people. And it's almost as if we're not horrified by this passage, we're not listening. We don't have to protect Jesus. Jesus can stand on his own here. And the truth is, there's a lot of ways to interpret it, but it comes down to two. The first one is Jesus is a human, which we all agree. We proclaim that and also fully God. But here in this human moment, maybe because he lived in a deeply racist culture who saw Canaanites as dogs, and then turned around and proclaimed that God was the God of the whole world, loved everybody. And then we wonder, how can those folks go from Sunday to murdering people in the streets? Jesus lived in a deeply racist culture. Now, they were oppressed, no doubt, by the Romans, not the Canaanites. So they let it roll downhill. Basically says we're probably all possibly guilty of it. The difference is, who has the power? But in that moment, who had the power? Jesus did. Maybe in just that moment, Jesus was caught without his politically correct filter up. Like politicians getting caught in blackface or something. Probably not comfortable with that connection. That's why I put it in there. But the second one, which I actually lean into a little bit, is that, but it's also troubling, I'll tell you why. That Jesus lived in a deeply racist culture and decided this was the moment to show his disciples that the supremacy of any culture is an anathema to the gospel. I like that a lot better. But before you get too comfortable with it, he still called her a dog to her face. Was Jesus comfortable using this woman as an object lesson for the disciples? Yeah, that's women's story. Object, subject. But if this gospel passage has anything to teach us here, and I think it is, that it's a reminder of the power of culture, the way it can blind us to the stuff we carry around, that we pretend not to believe or internalize, that tells us that we are less than or that we are better than someone else. But those messages are reflected all the time. And the United States culture, and the culture of American Christianity, is rooted in white supremacy. That American Christianity that was okay with slavery and genocide and war, the list is longer than that, and I'm going to stop there for time. It is part of who we are, even as we push back against it and say, no, that's not who we are. And it impacts us. It scars us. And it doesn't go away because we're just nice. Anybody can be nice, at least to your face. But what about power? Who's in control? And I've said this already, and I say it in love, because I've been here a long time. I'm not pointing fingers. We're all part of this. It resides in me too. Just because we worship together in this place does not mean we're immune to it. It might make us a little more aware of it. But I believe for us to go forward, we have to be more deliberate to root it out. To name the microaggressions that occur. I see them. I'm committing to point some of those out. And then to listen. When people say, hey, you might not have intended this, but you need to know what that means. And be okay with not going, oh, yes, but I'm a nice person, saying, okay, I'm sorry I hurt you. I didn't know that. It wasn't my intention, but I and we are responsible for the result of our actions, whether they were our intentions or not. That's what God's love looks like. And to look, and to listen, And then to begin to look at the very structure of our congregation. To figure out, how are we perpetuating white supremacy in this place? To say it clearly, to own it. Because otherwise we're denying it and perpetuating it. It is impossible not to have it perpetuated here in this place if it exists outside in the world around us, no matter how hard we try. So it requires accountability and listening and the ability to say, you're right. And every week in church we do this theologically. I'm a sinner, I've messed up, forgive me, because without you, O Lord, I can't do this. All things are possible with God. But not until we say, humble ourselves and admit. I believe that the only way forward for Westminster to commit to doing this is to become what they call deliberately anti-racist. There's a whole body of work on how that happens, and it's possible. The transformation really begins. It's actually coming from a resource. I'd quote it, but it's a really long title, and I'll put it in the notes. The transformation begins with developing a comprehensive understanding of how racism and oppression operate within an organization's own walls. We're not the only folks dealing with this, you see. And it is then from this analysis, and now that comes deeper commitments and concrete plans to dismantle racism within the organization and the larger society. Being nice isn't going to be enough. It's not a bad start, because there's a lot of not niceness out there today. But if that's our bar, we're not doing our work. There's a lot of cost. But until we're able to acknowledge the history, what has gone on, and then particularly for white folk to learn to listen more. I know this is weird, a preacher going on for 15 minutes talking about how white folk need to listen more. But I believe it's possible. Because one of the things that I've really appreciated about getting to read James Cone again was this concept of what baptism really means for him. He sees it as we talk about, right? Death and new life, that we die to the sinfulness. And he interprets that for Americans living in North America, in the seat of white supremacy, that baptism can only mean death to white supremacy. Now we can say and use those words, but the way that we put our hands and feet to those kinds of theological understandings is to begin to commit that in our own midst. It is possible for us, and Jesus can lead the way if we are willing. And I know that the session of the church is working to do just this as we think about our mission going forward. So I felt comfortable enough to go ahead and preach all of these things, believing and knowing to encourage them in their work, but to recognize that it will not be easy, but it's worth the possibility of transformation. Transformation is coming, and I believe liberation is possible. If you take the whole of Matthew's gospel, at the very beginning, it's very clear that Jesus has come just for the children of Israel. And that's reaffirmed here in chapter 15. I'd like to think that Jesus listened to this woman and learned a new way of being in the world. You don't have to like that interpretation, but it's one I like, and I'll tell you why. Because what happens at the end, we talk about the Great Commission. And if you take the Great Commission and just slice it out of there, it says we're supposed to go, turn everybody into Christians. But if you consider it as the whole part of Matthew's gospel, what you see is a movement that began in one particular place, but then extends to the whole world, all the nations, so that no one is excluded from God's grace. But that means that no one culture gets to set the agenda when it comes to the life of the church. This is what happens when you try to pack multiple weeks into 1 week. I guess I would say this, that one of my concerns over the years is as we look back, have we looked enough at what it means for us going forward? It's got to be easy to look at the things that Dr. King lifted up and realizes that a whole lot of things haven't changed as much as we would have hoped. And that's because just as racism doesn't go away without deliberate resistance, racism is being pushed forward with an agenda. And that is why we need to join together more than ever and figure out how to embody that as a gift for the world. That's our commission. That's our call. And that is the hope we share in Jesus Christ.